We do such a good job at this conference of bringing about, the why. Farmers are extremely innovative and inventive, and if they just know why they need to do something, they'll build it, they'll figure it out, they'll do some way to figure this out. And so if you didn't get a little bit of why injected into you with Christine Jones and then with Jason Weller on the market, seeing what market drivers we have, you ought to have a little bit of want to in you, and probably if you're in this room, you've already got that want to anyway. So the rest of the sessions, the reason I like this conference is there's so much practical information. You listen to Dave Brandt, and you listen to the farmers, and you listen to the practical applications so that we don't have to endure that negative side of that economics equation. We figure out how to avoid those train wrecks and avoid those things. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about some of those basic principles that if you're making a switch or even if you're in the middle of trying to adopt a soil health management system, there's a few underlying principles that you have to have in the back of your mind. There's a few underlying managements that'll keep you from having one of those unintended consequences that all of a sudden sends you into a negative economic spiral. So we'll try to avoid those. So a lot of people would think, why are we even worried about soil health? In our part of the world, record yields. You look across the Corn Belt, a lot of states had record corn and soybean yields. So if we've got record corn and soybean yields, there would be a lot of farmers that would be a little bit complacent whether anything new in their management needs to take place, right? And so why would I make a change when I'm experiencing some of the best yields ever recorded, and so it's even statewide. So we see trends have been going up for quite a while. We keep a positive trend on yield. However, some of those yields are at the expense of grain quality, like Christine talked about, and so some of those are also at the expense of our soil quality. And so as we've gained in a lot of ways in agriculture, if we're going to be completely sustainable, like Jason talks about, then we're going to have to also protect that resource and turn that resource loss into a gain also, because it is ultimately the soil and all the microbes and all the parts of the water in the soil and those systems that we will have to have if we're going to be long-term sustainable at this agriculture enterprise. So as we look, we know we've got I can pull slides from almost every university in every state would show the same thing, that over a long period of time we've lost a huge amount of our organic matter. And this is worldwide. This is not just in the United States. It's just because our agricultural systems has just what Christine says. It's caused us to want and manage for bare soil way too much of the season. And so anytime it's bare, we're actually losing at that moment, we're losing our soil organic matter because we're losing the life in the soil. So if we're going to start regenerating that, we have to look at, some of the principles. So if we have some of our soils, even if, we talk about soil erosion all the time, and I've said it at this conference, I think, before. If you go from here north and up through this whole lake bed region, there's a lot of people that when somebody on the stage starts talking about horrendous soil erosion, they sit back and say, boy, I feel sorry for those suckers. They're over there where it really erodes, right? But what we have is a situation when we get a degraded soil, when we get loss of organic matter, when we lose that aggregate stability. A lot of times we've done that slake test up here. We still endure and suffer from, our productivity suffers from the loss of soil function that's the same as associated in the three processes that we get in erosion. Okay, what are those three processes? You guys know that? Detachment's the first one. Transport and deposition. So if you're in a perfectly flat, this is a mollisol soil in central Illinois, some of the best soil on the planet. If I asked those farmers, do you have an erosion problem, they would say the same thing that you would say up here in the Lake Erie Basin. However, when you have no aggregate stability, when the raindrops hit that soil, is there detachment? is there transport? Where to? Or straight down, and where is it deposited? Where's the deposition? Into that all-important pore space that we've talked about time and time again at this conference. If you don't have that pore space, then you have now lost full production potential, and you've lost soil functions that are critical for production, especially when you have weather extremes and you need to be resilient. You have to have those soil functions, and those have in many cases been lost. Even though this field might have yielded 220 bushels, that just means it probably could have yielded 300 bushels if you've lost those functions. So even though yields are going up, we've got a lot of genetics, we've got a lot of technology that's available that's making yields go up. But if we're not restoring full soil function, then we're going to have areas of the field that do things like this in extreme weather times. Okay, we haven't got a very resilient system, so we have to look at the total function of the soil. And so we know some of the things, some of the practices. We've talked about them at this conference for years. How to regenerate some of those functions. You know, if we don't do anything, then we keep. You know, if you do what you did, then you get what you got. If you got degradation going on, and you keep doing the same thing, you're going to have degradation go on. But if we start integrating some of these crops that bring some of the life back to the soil, that's what these have always been about, is trying to find a way to restore life back to the soil. Now, we didn't always talk about that. We talked about erosion and reducing erosion and doing some of these things. But we were always trying to restore a habitat that supports life back in that soil. And if you look at the practices, they're doing those things, okay? So if we look at the definition of soil health, and I hate that some groups and folks have decided that soil health is something that, well, that's just kind of foo-foo, that kind of makes you feel good, that soil health term, but it's not really what we're about as far as production and important things like that. But the reality is, when we're talking about soil health, at least when in the context and the groups that I work with, we're talking about, you know, the continued capacity of a soil to function as a living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and us, okay? It's a continued capacity. It doesn't mean whether it rains, shines, too much rain, not enough rain. We have to have a continued capacity of that soil to function, whatever the climate, whatever the weather for that year gives us, okay? And we have to do that. We have to understand it is a living ecosystem. If you didn't get that from Christine's talk, then I can't help you, okay? So it's a living ecosystem. And if we're going to manage a living ecosystem, we're going to manage it a lot differently than if it was just a pile of crushed, weathered stone, right? So if we're going to have that, and we want it to function at a very high level in all different extremes, we're going to have these functions. We're going to try to put these back. We're going to have nutrient cycling. We're going to have infiltration. Wherever the raindrop lands, it needs to have the opportunity to go into the matrix of the soil right there. There needs to be aggregate stability. There needs to be pore space for it to go into that soil matrix right there. Farmers look at me and say, well, you know, it rained 2 inches last night. What are you going to do? Well, what you're going to do is you're going to have a system that can have a 2-inch rainfall and it still go into that soil, because it can. It does. We don't have to accept that it won't go in. It can go in, okay? And if we get that, then we get really good filtering and buffering. The physical stability and support comes back. And then we get habitat for biodiversity. And if we get this really is the beginning, right? So if we develop the habitat for biodiversity, we come all the way up to the top, and all of these functions are now regaining. They're building again. They're regenerating. And so it really starts with the habitat for the microbes. And if you're going to have the living ecosystem that you're managing for, then you have to do what a lot of these farmers have decided in their own mind, and their relentless pursuit for regenerating this soil. And many of the researchers that are working in this arena today were compiling and working together, bringing these groups together to develop practical solutions to get this done. Okay? The old idea that we can't change soil, not true. We grew up that a soil is a soil is a soil, George. But the reality is we know today that how we've managed the soil, especially over decades of management, we absolutely have changed it, and we now know how to change it back and regenerate some of those traits, okay? So these guys have been the pioneers and led the way. So what we're trying to share at this conference is, you know, they've had to make the mistakes. Everybody doesn't have to make the same mistakes that they made. So we're going to try to share some of the things that help us avoid some of those unintended consequences. If you're going to set this management system up, though, you do have to have an understanding, and I know this is review for a lot of you. If you don't understand these 4 principles, if it's not part of every management decision that you make, then you're not managing for a living ecosystem, okay? If you've got to have these 4 principles, you know, we talked about minimize disturbance. That sounds a lot like no-till. We talk about that a lot at this conference, but there's more than just physical disturbance. There's chemical disturbance, and there's biological disturbance as well that can have a negative effect. So you want to minimize disturbances of all kinds. Maximize soil cover. Just corn beans or continuous beans in a no-till system won't give you enough of that habitat that we're trying to get to restore the life, okay? We just can't do it without having more cover than we get in a lot of our corn bean rotations. If you don't believe that diversity is important, we need to maximize diversity because that is the food for the organisms. We got to try to meet that quorum that Christine talked about, if at all possible. But we won't be able to maybe get that maximized right away in our corn bean rotations, but we can move several good steps forward, okay? We want to try to do that. And then if the living roots are going to be feeding those microbes, then we've got to maximize the presence of living ones. We've got to do more than just those 3 months that we have corn and soybeans out there. Okay, there's a lot of other time that we need to be feeding the microbes and getting something, keeping something growing. So these 4 principles are at the back of our mind at every management decision, every operation we make across the field, if at all possible. They just need to be ingrained in your brain. And we understand why they're important, because these over here, we talk about these as being the protector principles, you know, minimize disturbance, maximize cover. That protects the soil aggregates. That protects from huge temperature swings. That protects from raindrop energy and a lot of the adverse things that we wouldn't like as living organisms. We would like protection from some of those elements. So does the organisms in the soil. But if you're actually going to grow this, if you're going to regenerate this, we got to go beyond just that, right? We actually did pretty good with a lot of these things for a long time, but we've only recently discovered how important it is to feed the life in the soil and feed that living that ecosystem. So if we have that as a principle that we're going to feed and we're going to grow more different diverse groups, and then if we're going to have more diverse biology in the soil, we're going to have to provide more diverse food stuff above, and that's where that whole diverse living plants thing comes in that Christine was talking about. Okay? So I talked to a lot of farmers, and some of you have seen these slides, but to validate that this is real, that this is not foo-foo we're talking about, right? Most of you have seen yield maps. You've got yield maps. This is actually an enhanced color photograph that we take right at silking time with our in-field advantage program in Indiana. Okay? And so we look at these enhanced the colors. So we look at the pale colors, and most of us in the room have looked at photography or yield maps. Would that be a high yielding potential or low yielding potential? What's the health of that crop? It's lower there in that part of the field, right? It's lower because we've probably had some historic soil erosion. The soil's thinner, maybe less fertile. What's these darker green valleys here? What's that? Swales. And there's more organic matter. There's more water. Healthier crop. Probably higher yield when you look at the yield map there, right? We have one anomaly though that keeps showing up that's going up and down, up and down. This field has a lot of roll to it. But this one dark green color of really healthy crops is transcending the highs and the lows in the field. And what would you say that is right there? That's good high health all the way down through there. Okay? Can you see that? Did everybody see Christine's fence row picture? that she showed this morning? We know it's a fence row because when we overlay our CLU layer, our ownership layer, that was even a property line, so we know that fence row was there a long time because you know how neighbors, they don't want the other neighbor coming across the line, so we keep that fence right there for a long time, right? So we know that fence row's been there a while, and so when that fence row finally comes out, we see what we call the fence row effect. Okay, and every farmer knows this, right? So you ask the farmers in the room, what does the yield mean? What kind of a yield difference is there? Is it just a little bit of difference in that yield right there on the yield map? I'm seeing no. It's significant. It's a big yield difference, right? I mean, if you've looked at these maps, we're not talking about 10 bushels of corn. We're talking 30, 40, maybe 50 bushels of corn difference. It's a big difference. Is that a higher fertility? Have you been spreading all your fertilizers? Do you need to call the retailer and say, why have you been spreading all the fertilizer in my fence row, right? Not necessarily. Let me ask you about that fence row, though. I'm trying to validate my whole 4 principles. I'm going a long way around it, right? Is that fence row had much disturbance? What else has it had? It's had cover the whole time, right? What else has it had? Diversity. How about living roots? For a long time, it's had all of that. It might have had livestock if there was a fence, right? So we might even have the what a lot of people talk about the fifth principle is introduce livestock. But it's probably had livestock. A lot of those living organisms are the livestock in this situation, even if you didn't have livestock out there. So that fence row effect matches perfectly with the principles. And most farmers will say, if I could replicate that across my whole farm, they always tell me, Fisher said, yeah, but I can't rent enough just fence rows. I got to rent the whole farm. What if we know now enough to know, if we know about those 4 principles and we have the expertise to know how to integrate those principles through management across our whole acres? Could we get the fence row effect across the whole farm? Of course we can. We have people in this room that talk to you every year that have done this on a regular basis. We have fields that even in a really bad year, here's the neighbor farm, here's Jack Maloney's farm. Now, I was told by Jack that 2 generations ago this was Grandpa's farm. This was all one farm. You know what happens when Grandpa leaves, and you know, farms get split up, and then 2 generations later, here's Cousin Eddie's farm. I don't know if its name's Cousin Eddie, you know, but you get what I mean, right? So people love to look, you know, if we've adopted here a long-term no-till plus cover crops and have been doing this for 10 plus years, actually 20 plus years, when we get a really crazy weather pattern, the soil health reveals itself. We've now got the fence row effect helping us through the whole farm over here, and we're not able to accomplish that on this side. So that makes it real. This is real production potential that we're talking about. This is not foo-foo. This doesn't just make us feel good. Yeah, Jack feels pretty good about that, but mostly because of the checks that come back from the market. The kind of system that we put together is a system that we've talked about a lot here at this conference. Quality no-till, not just no-till. Does every no-till, does the absence of tillage guarantee good things? That's why we have this conference. You can really mess up no-till. It can be a yield loss. Happens all the time. Happens on a lot of farmers' farms. Happens on a lot of research farms. Because they didn't go to the guys who've been doing it for a long time and figure out what happened, what did you learn along the way so that we can avoid pitfalls. So when I talk about quality no-till, I'm talking about we're doing a lot of things right. That we've got the planter set right. We got the right equipment. We understand how to spread residue. We'll go into some of those things. But then as I put the system together, we're going to have cover crops, but not just any old cover crop. As it turns out, certain cover crops do better in front of other crops in the rotation. Okay? And so the cover crops and the no-till and the crop rotation all have to complement each other. If you do all of these things, then you better start changing how you manage your nutrients, because now your nutrients are coming from a whole different place and a whole different time. We'll talk in a minute. The best job you do at applying nutrients still is only half the story. The rest of it's coming from the microbes and what is happening in your management. What did you just do management-wise that changed the microbial delivery of nutrients? So if you don't understand that part and plug that back into the equation, then you're missing half the story. Same way with your pests. If you don't understand that you're creating a system for life, this encourages life, and it needs to encourage the beneficials, but it will probably also provide a habitat for pests. So you want to make sure that if your pests are going to have a good habitat, your beneficials have an even better habitat. In other words, don't knock out your beneficials, because then the pests are left. So now you've got a whole different paradigm. You've got to manage your pests slightly different in this scenario. And all these practices need to be working together. They're all working collaboratively and as a system. And of course, the whole of the system far exceeds the sum of its parts if we do this correctly. That's the goal. Okay, so we got to have a game plan if we're going to do this. If we're going to have this kind of a system, we got to come up with a game plan. And as you put that down, some of those management principles that we have to understand. I'm only going to hit just a few of them. I'm going to try to go through them pretty quickly. We've got to have a whole new game plan for nutrient management, a whole new game plan for our cover crop. Termination is something that can bite us if we don't understand how to do that or when to do that or why to do that. And then pest management, and then we're going to have to learn how to read the weather, read the defense a little better as a game time player. Okay? And so we look at these. These are just 4 key things that we're going to hit on. This isn't certainly the whole system. We're going to talk first of all about nutrient management. Okay, let's talk about changes. You've stopped tilling the soil now, and maybe you've introduced cover crops. You have just changed the carbon to nitrogen cycle, and now that's going to change the delivery of nutrients from the microbes in the soil. If you don't know that's going to happen, it can bite you. If you do know that's going to happen and know how to manage for it, it's a major benefit. Okay, so we want it to be a major benefit. So there's just a few key things. This isn't the whole thing, but we spend a whole day on just the ecological nutrient management a lot of times. But we have to understand just a few key things, how to do it. And if we understand the 4 R's, and we should be, for every nutrient that we're applying, we need to do the best job we possibly can of placing it, timing it, selecting the right rate and the right place for the right source for those nutrients. Those 4 R's are important for everything that we apply. However, if you don't understand in a soil health management system, if you don't understand that they must include the soil organic matter and the organic nutrient contribution, what those microbes are going to deliver, if you don't understand that, that's over half of the nutrient equation that ultimately winds up in your plant, in your crop. Okay? So we've seen a lot of these nitrogen mineralization and immobilization kind of diagrams, and we see how here's the nitrogen coming in. And this is just one example. Here's our application of nitrogen. Then it can go through hydrolysis or mineralization. It might turn into ammonium, and then through another chemical process it volatilizes, or maybe it goes through another chemical process and goes through nitrification, and then it goes through another chemical process that maybe lets it leach. And I've said chemical and nobody's yelled anything. I keep saying chemical process, chemical process, chemical process. Is it a chemical process? Or every one of those processes, every time nitrogen changes form, it's biochemical, it's biologically derived. The biology is driving these processes. And so if we don't understand that part, and we don't understand when we change our management what that does to this, it can cause some unintended consequences. If we do know it and we do know how to manage for it, then it's a major benefit for us. Okay? So let's talk about that just real quickly, a real key thing. First of all, I could have pulled one of many, many studies that's been done on this. It talks about the applied fertilizer and all of the inputs and all this, but at the end of the day, they can use radioisotopes to track the fertilizer that we apply and how much of that ultimately winds up in the corn, and a very small percent of it. Okay? Because nature intends that plant to get its nutrients from the relationship it develops in the soil with the microbes. That's where nature built a system of providing nutrients to that plant. As good a job as we can do with the 4 R's, it's still going to get over half of its nutrients from the microbial process in the soil. It's just how nature did it. We still need to do the 4 R's, but I want you to know that if we don't understand this part, this is what bites a lot of people when they don't understand this. Okay? So, just a quick scenario, and maybe you've seen this before. In all of our agronomy and all of our hybrid selection, the agronomy, the system that we were in was a full-width tillage system, right? For most of our years in agriculture, that's how we've done this. And so, in that scenario, we can track microbial activity, and if we check microbial activity, that's respiration, right? We're measuring CO2. That's how we know how much microbial activity there is. And in our typical full-width tillage system, we're getting a big spike in CO2 or microbial activity at this stage. Now, what do we know about when CO2 is released from microbial activity? What does it leave behind? If CO2 is leaving, that's carbon leaving. Remember the percents of all the different nutrients that's in soil organic matter? Remember that? So if CO2 is leaving, it's leaving behind free and available nutrients at that moment, right? So what just happened in our conventional or normal full-width tillage system right here that caused this spike? What likely happened? What operation? The last spring tillage, that field cultivator, that cultiwhomper went through there. It cut it, sifted it, pounded it, shook it, all in one pass, right? It did a lot of stirring and fluffing and oxidizing all at one time. So we got a big flush of CO2 that left. Now that CO2 that left, it wasn't really a crop canopy developed yet, so that just kind of left. But it did leave behind a really nice flush of nutrients, plant available nutrients in the soil right there, right? So when we stop tilling, if we don't do that tillage pass in the spring, how does that change our microbial activity? Not as much, right? Not as much early. So if there's not as much early, then we didn't get as much released nutrients, plant available nutrients, because the microbes are still alive. They still have those nutrients in their body. We didn't kill them all with tillage, right? They're still there. So, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if you didn't know it was happening and you want really high corn yields, and the corn yield varieties that you've selected for 50 years came from a system that had spring tillage, you might miss something here, right? You may miss some early nitrogen for that corn early on when it's, what else is going on about this time of year for corn? Right in here. It's germinating, and then pretty soon thereafter at V5, it's determining ear size, right? So under the no-till system, and then this is just no-till. What if we added a cover crop? We would push this even back. Now, let me back this up. There's more total respiration. There may be more late-season nutrient release in this no-till system. That's a good thing. That's when we have the rapid uptake right in here. So we want that later delivery. But if we didn't know that this was happening, when we switched this, then we might have missed some yield opportunity, because once we determine the ear size, then we can miss some of that early. So when you're in an early transition stage, why do we talk about starter fertilizer in no-till? People have talked about starter fertilizer all the time, but it's really important, especially when you go from tillage to no-till, and then now we're even going to add a cover crop that also is going to assimilate even more of that nutrient early in that transition. Later in the transition, cycling will happen really good, and this will be less of an issue, but the early transition is where this can really bite you. Okay? So that's why when we talk about setting up a quality no-till system, and we talk about that our nutrient management needs to be adapted to this new no-till system, then that's why we talk about putting starter fertilizer on planters, especially early in the growth cycle, early in the transition cycle. Okay? So we see benefit from starter and maybe starter plus even sulfur now that we've cleaned up the atmosphere. Okay? So that's just one little trick when we talk about putting two systems together. We're going to no-till, but we've also then got to adapt our nutrient management or we'll have some unintended consequences. Just some baseline management that helps us not suffer economic loss as we make a transition. So if we add cover crops to that scenario and we add cereal rye ahead of corn, and we look at this corn plant right here, how do you guys think about this corn plant, this corn crop? Is it looking pretty good or is it a little anemic? It's looking a little weak for my taste, okay? This is a producer that just didn't know. This is a highly erodible field. It doesn't look like it here, but it's a highly erodible field, and they mostly wanted erosion control, so they planted cereal rye on that bean stubble. That's the intuitive thing that would come to all of us, or most of us. Get some cover on those soybean stubbles so that we don't have erosion through the winter. But if you really think through the whole system, the reality is that cereal rye is competing for the same key nutrients that the corn plant wants, especially early on, especially when we are no longer tilling the soil. Okay? So what could we have done management-wise here to fix this? Could have had a little starter. Okay? Maybe not selected cereal rye ahead of corn as our first operation as we make a transition, right? Maybe there's another place to start this system, okay? We'll talk about that. The thing that's really driving this whole microbial process is now we've messed with the C to N, the carbon and nitrogen in the soil, okay? So when we put something like cereal rye ahead of corn, we immediately raise the C to N in that scenario, and that'd be okay if we were planting soybeans because they can make their own nitrogen, but ahead of corn, that in an early stage of transition, that's going to be something that's going to actually immobilize a lot of your nitrogen. Okay, so if we could have, we would do what Dave Brandt does, and we'd plant wheat, and then we'd come in here and we'd plant a whole bunch of these kind of things that pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere before we plant corn. Okay, that would be the best case scenario. If you're just in a corn bean rotation, then you want to be a little more strategic how you manage that cover crop for a lower C to N. Okay? So rye straw has 82:1. Vegetative rye cover crop, it changes very rapidly, rye does. You can get quite a bit of growth and it's still in more of a vegetative stage, so it's down here in an area that still should be pretty good for corn, especially if you've got some starter on out there, okay? So you look for opportunities management-wise to either use something. A lot of people early on in their transition will use something that breaks down faster in the way of a cover crop, or you're gonna have something over here that might possibly immobilize some of your nitrogen early on. So ideally, if we could go with a lower carbon to nitrogen or manage that cover crop for lower carbon to nitrogen early in the transition ahead of corn, that would be what you'd want to do, okay? And if you do that, then that corn crop will release, the cover crop and all the microbes and everything will start providing nutrients to that crop in a timely fashion, and you're going to have a very healthy crop right out of the gate, okay? You shouldn't have to have a token yield loss, okay? We don't expect that. What about soybeans? Ahead of soybeans, we can plant something that's high C to N, okay? So nutrient immobilization from a nitrogen standpoint is less important because cereal rye and the corn stalks, we plant soybeans into corn stalks, which is super high C to N all the time, and they do quite well. Okay, so planting cereal rye ahead of soybeans behind corn makes a lot of management sense. That's a good management principle to start. It's a good starting point because soybeans into that they take advantage of a lot of the a lot of the weed control, the late season water, and then that late release of nutrients really helps during pod fill. Okay, so starting soybeans into that high carbon environment is a really good starting place because they're naturally adapted to that system. Okay, let's look at cover crop termination and then how to read the weather, and then if we got time, we'll go into the other. So if we're going to start down this soil health road and we're in a corn bean rotation and we're early in the transition, first thing we want to think about is what would be my first strategy? Well, if I was going to start, then I would probably take a look at wanting to plant soybeans first. And if I plant soybeans first, then I immediately, the very first year, can let that cereal rye get nice and big. Okay? I want it to get. It doesn't have to be head high. If you're early this, I don't want to scare you to death, but early on, get yourself just a little bit of growth here so that you know you've got those roots developed really well. And in soybeans, you can let those soybeans go into that cereal rye without a major penalty. You know, it's like Dave said, very few times do I not see a yield improvement when we plant soybeans in the cereal rye, and even pretty good sized cereal rye. So if it does turn wet on you, you don't have to be too scared. I mean, you can kill it, you can kill it at 12 inches or a little higher ahead of time. What you don't want to do, this will bite you if you do this. You know, if your cereal rye starts getting bigger than this, and it's going to be soybean crop, you start reading that a little bit. If it starts getting too big, then you better be thinking about switching and planting green. Okay? If you're going to kill it at a foot, and you know you're going to have some dry weather and 2 weeks later you're going to plant, you can kill it early before you plant and you won't have a total train wreck. But I'm just saying, if you let that thing get a little bit bigger and you start seeing some seed heads stick out, now it's at a time the last thing you want to do is kill it and then get a rain. Now you got a wet quagmire. You want to think very seriously about planting green into that taller cereal rye once it gets bigger. Okay? And if you do that, then you've still got options. You can spray it just right before you plant or right after you plant. There's even people that are roller crimping even much later that are having some pretty good success with that. So when you start seeing some seed heads pop out, now you're in a situation where you really need to think about planting first or planting green. Okay? Follow me on that? Some of the biggest train wrecks I've seen is where they kill something, they get nervous and they kill it at that growth stage right there, but they're not ready to plant yet. And then it becomes a rubbery, wet mess. We don't want that. Okay? So that you don't want this right here. Because this is what happens when you kill it, you get nervous, you kill it, and then you get a rain, and now you may never get that field planted the way you want it. Okay? So pest management, let's look at that just a little bit. How we want to look at this? Well, we've got a system. We said we're going to manage this as a living ecosystem, and so you're going to have a whole new management strategy and a true integrated pest management strategy. And if you have a true integrated pest management strategy, then it's one that's going to employ. It's going to utilize holistic management, limit pest opportunities, not preventative pest treatment, but limit pest opportunities is what that uses. Integrates predator-prey relationships. Remember the carabid beetle from this morning, and employs beneficial biology and cultural practices. This kind of a practice these are seldom based on preventative chemistry. Okay? Unfortunately, across a lot of our region, we're using a lot of preventative chemistry. And there's unintended consequences of that. A lot of those carabid beetles that are very, very beneficial to us are very sensitive to some of the chemistry we're using as a preventative measure. Okay? We need to go back to actually scout and treat type management. Utilize technology and chemical treatments when necessary. I'm not telling you don't use these. I'm just saying don't use them as an insurance policy. Use them judiciously, or we'll lose them. We'll lose the effectiveness of them, and we'll lose them altogether. Okay, so we have to look at this a little different. We'll have new resources that we're not used to using before. And here's just one that I pulled out, the Xerxes Society's book, Farming with Beneficial Insects. I pulled out one little firefly. I hear all the time over here in Ohio that we have these slug issues, right? And I think Jim's probably, are you going to do your slug talk, Jim? Jim will go into this more, but this is a great book. Look at this one right here. I opened this one up. I love fireflies. I love going out at night and watch the fireflies. Probably left over from when I was a kid, right? Do you see fireflies out in your fields a lot? A lot of the people in this room probably do. Do you see them everywhere in all fields? Not much. I'll just tell you that fireflies are very, very susceptible to some of our insurance chemistries, okay? And so let me click on this. This one little excerpt. I love this book because it gives you common prey of this firefly, and it's mostly when it's in the larval stage. Look what it eats. Top prey: snails, slugs, caterpillars. Why didn't it just say all things that want to eat my crop? It wants to eat them. That'd be easier, wouldn't it? Because that's what they want to eat. Well, look at this family. What family is that? Coleoptera. Big beetle family, right? Big beetle family. Shannon, you could have given this part better than I can. You've done a good job. Very important predators that are out there. We hear a lot about the pollinators and all that kind of stuff. As a row crop farmer, I'm equally as worried about, do I have some of these? Because if I get a big flight of armyworms and they're laying egg masses, I just assume somebody like this really liked those and found those delectable. Okay? That's what I'd really like to have. Okay? So, just by mere coincidence, that band called the Beatles sang a song, Let It Be. Okay? So maybe we need to make that our motto for pest management, for our soil health management systems. We'll finish up on some key items for how to read the weather in the spring. Sometimes it just flat rains. We need to have a game plan, but we need to be a game time player that can read the defense, okay? And so it affects our pest management at the same time as some of our weather and some of the things I just talked about. If you look down here in a really wet spring, back to those, you can't see them. But this is my field, actually. There's just slugs everywhere. And you can see what's happening here. It's getting big. It's a wet year. I'm not getting anything terminated yet. And this field, believe it or not, is getting ready to go to corn. So I'm getting a little nervous. But I keep watching this. I've done some of that integrated pest management now for about 3 or 4 years. And I've got some really good populations. If I look closer, I've got a lot of good populations of the beneficial organisms. So I watch this, and guess what? Never had a slug issue in a very, very wet year. Okay? So how do we turn that situation? It's some of what I just talked about. Is we need to have a management strategy that allows those beneficials, and then as it turns out, the crop does okay. Now this is a different situation. This was this past year, and this was one of those years that I didn't do as good a job of reading the season as I wanted to. I kept letting that annual ryegrass get a little bigger, because I wanted those roots to go down. And they kept talking about rain coming, and did the rain ever come? It did not. We went from winter last year, one day, the very next day it was summer. And that was the last drop of rain we received for 6 weeks at our house. Last drop. And I was waited a little bit, thought I'd let that cover crop, because it had been real cold, so I had cover crop that tall. So I wanted that cover crop to grow. I was listening to my own advice for once. Wrong, but I was making the right decision based on historical perspective, but that year I had no idea we were not going to get any rain. And I'm just telling you, I probably lost a little yield. The corn all came up. It did okay. But I probably lost some yield because for the first time, that annual ryegrass actually pulled too much moisture out of the ground. I let too much come out. If I knew then what I know now, if I known then what I know now, I would have killed that cover crop earlier because it was using valuable moisture that who knew in Indiana we're going to run out of moisture in the spring of the year. Okay? So you try to read the season the best that you possibly can. Fortunately, this is a very, very rare occurrence. That corn still made 180 bushel, but it probably would have made, you know, a couple hundred to 220. There were record yields in our area. And so that would have been a little better. Okay? Still turned out better toward the middle of the summer. Looked okay, but I think when it was determining its ear size, it was under some stress. And that was probably the key that probably lost some of my yield. Okay? So, do you have a plan for a variable situation? You need to have a plan. You need backup plans. You can't just have a game plan and stick to it. That's what I'm doing, and that's the only thing I'm doing. That's what makes this a hard system for a lot of people. Because a lot of our monoculture, that's why we've switched to monocultures. We can just lay out a plan, stick to it, and usually things work out. And we've now introduced some variabilities into this system that is going to make us have to be make game time decisions that aren't as static as we like to have in our comfort. We're very risk averse, you know, as a species, you know, and so that bothers a lot of us. Okay. One thing about cover crops we found out the last 2 years is I'm going to try to push toward earlier establishment in any way that I possibly can because I've got to get that fall growth. That helps me manage. It's what Dave said. I can manage a big cover crop easier than I can manage one that didn't get me any growth. It's going to do more for me and it's going to be more predictable actually. And so I want more fall growth, so I'm going to do whatever I can to have more fall growth, whatever I can. But no matter what the adversity hands you in this kind of a system, you know, how do we gain resilience to harsh weather? I think time and time again it will prove out that when in doubt, keep a living root out there. Keep a living plant more of the year. More diversity if at all possible, but keep a living root, feeding those microbes, feeding that workforce that you've got under the ground is how we're going to have that kind of resilience. Okay? So remember the principles and have these in the back of your mind as far as every management decision that you make. And if you do that, then the crop's going to talk to you, and it's going to tell you that things are going pretty good, okay? It's going to tell you, you know, hey, thanks for all you're doing, and you will reap the rewards from having this good management. Look at those corn roots. Those rhizose sheaths looking pretty good on that. That's what we want to see when we dig up our corn roots. Okay? The golden principle, lack of cover, is seldom a good thing. It goes for a lot of us in the room. You know, lack of cover would be a bad thing for things don't always go the way that you plan, but have a plan anyway. And if you have a good plan and you understand how this living ecosystem plays out and how it delivers nutrients and delivers resources to your crop, then you'll have a system that will endure just about whatever Mother Nature gives you. Okay? So if we have these sound principles at the back of our mind with every management decision that we do, then that's going to lead to regenerating soil health, regenerate those soil functions that are vital to us in all kinds of weather extremes and years. And so have that plan, but keep coming to conferences like this where you can hear not only the why, but the how-tos.